So welcome to Pickering Public Library's Zoom presentation of vegetable gardening in containers presented by Durham Master Gardeners. And we have Ingrid here with us tonight to tell us all about how to grow a vegetable garden in a container, which is very helpful. So Ingrid, did you want to tell us a little bit about Durham Master Gardeners? Because I feel like you're going to do it better than I can.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. So, for those of you who are joining this evening, I'm a master gardener, and the Master Gardeners of Ontario is a volunteer group with, I think, I want to say about 630, 640 members across Ontario in 31 different groups. So the groups are regional. And our group, of course, is based here in Durham region, and we have groups that go from Windsor and London all the way to as far east as almost the Quebec border, and of course Ottawa. And we actually do have a group of master gardeners up in Cochrane, Ontario, which is Zone 2 for any of you who know what the zones are, and they get snow in June and July. And so we are trained in horticulture. So we do have a certain amount of horticulture training. And we are, as I said, we're volunteers and we give gardening advice to the public. And because we live and garden in the same area as you, our advice is based on our region. So that's what we're all about. And I will have some contact information at the end of this presentation if you'd like to follow up and have more contact with Master Gardeners. As Jessica said, we're talking about vegetable gardening in containers this evening. And it's really something, vegetable gardening itself has kind of been very, very popular this year. And for a lot of people who just don't have the space, container seems to be the right option. So it seems that this is a very, very timely presentation. So I'm going to get into it. So first of all, let's start with very basic. Why would you want to grow your own vegetables? And when I did a little bit of thinking about this, and of course for my grandparents' generation, it was an absolute necessity. They had, I think my grandfather for years had a small allotment garden. They lived in the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, had a tiny, tiny, tiny little garden where he mostly grew flowers, but he had an allotment that he would ride his bike to and he would tend it, and that would be how they would get fresh vegetables throughout the summer. And for a lot of our grandparents or even our great-grandparents' generation, it was an absolute necessity. They had to have a garden because that was the only way that they could get fresh food. It was expensive, and feeding growing families was, it required them to grow much of their own food and preserve it along the way. So, but we have lots of other reasons today. It's no longer a necessity for us because, there are supermarkets, grocery stores, farm stands. If you're in Durham region, you just have to, drive a little bit north and you're going to come across a little farm market somewhere. And so we have the option of getting lots of fresh vegetables. But what I find is there are certain vegetables that just aren't commonly available. So, if you're interested in growing purple potted beans, for instance, it's great to get that variety, and you can buy seeds from a seed catalog and grow your own. And certainly, and you can see the one photo here of the bowl of what looks like tiny little watermelons. Those are actually called cucamelons, and they were like the biggest rage a couple of years ago. People really started getting into them. And it's actually almost a little, it's almost like a little pickle. It comes from Mexico. They're cucumbery, but they have a very kind of sour lime kind of hit to them as well. It's an acquired taste. They weren't popular in my house, but again, it's not something that you're going to find sold in the supermarket. And certainly if you have an ethnic background where there are certain vegetables that you grew up with that aren't readily available in Canada, that's another really great reason for going and growing your own vegetables. I'm showing some Romanesco cauliflower down here, which has that beautiful spiral green shape to it. Again, it's not something that you're going to see very often in the grocery store, or watermelon radishes. And tomatoes. What's interesting is, yes, you can buy, so-called heirloom tomatoes in the grocery store, but they have one variety. They have one variety of plum tomatoes. And usually if I buy green beans, all they have is one type of green bean. If you go to a seed catalog, you'd be shocked at how many pages of tomato varieties there are. It's something like 6 or 7 pages. It's incredible, the variety that you can get. And so it gives you the option to go and try different foods, or maybe grow some foods that you grew up with, or and I'm going to show you later in the presentation, if you're kind of a bit of a foodie and there's some interesting, people are Googling all kinds of recipes and coming up with new ideas, and there's some ethnic foods that maybe you want to try that are a little bit more difficult to find, and that's another reason to maybe try and grow your own. So lots of good reasons. And I think there's a chat available, Jessica, so if people want to put in the chat, if they want to put in some reasons why you are looking at growing your own vegetables, we'd like to hear from you why you're attending this and what kind of vegetables you're interested in growing. The other thing I want to comment on, of course, because gardening is the hot topic this year. I think everybody is gardening, whether they've ever been a gardener or not, everybody is gardening. Gardening is really good for you. There have been studies that have demonstrated that gardeners have lower rates of osteoporosis. So it's a good form of weight-bearing exercise for you. And gardeners, getting your hand into the soil is actually good for your mental well-being. So for all of us who are struggling with the effects of what this pandemic has done to us, forced us to stay at home for long periods of time, getting out in the garden is actually really good for your mental well-being. So great reasons. Final reason, grow your own vegetables. You can save a lot of money. So there you go. All right. So now I'm just going to talk in general, and this is part of our sort of introductory level of presentations that we do. So I'm going to assume that people don't necessarily have a lot of experience in growing vegetables. So let's just talk very quickly about what is a vegetable. A vegetable is any edible part of a plant that doesn't contain seed. Botanically speaking, anything that contains a seed in it is actually botanically classified as a fruit. So squash, tomatoes, cucumbers are technically fruits. However, I have a little comment on that on the next slide, but we'll talk about this first. So any part that you can eat, which includes the roots, so things like onions and potatoes are modified roots of a plant. Celery, which is a stem, asparagus, which is also a stem, broccoli and cauliflower are actually both flowers. Cauliflower kind of gives you a clue that that's the flower, and if you actually left it, it would open up and it would get tiny little yellow flowers on it. And of course, lettuce and spinach and other greens are just the leaves. So that's essentially what a vegetable is. So here's my little comment about what gardening knowledge. It's knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is knowing not to put it into a fruit salad. I always love to put that little joke in. So, botanists define it one way. Grocery stores will always put the tomatoes in the vegetable section because we consider it a vegetable. So that's kind of a quick introduction just to, why would you want to grow vegetables and what is a vegetable? And we're going to switch right now into growing into containers. So why would you want to grow in containers rather than in a garden? Well, because a lot of people don't have a garden. They're either renting or they're living in an apartment. Maybe they have a balcony. Maybe they're in a townhouse, but it has very limited amount of space available for any kind of a vegetable garden, so it makes sense to grow in containers. So growing in containers is a way for people who don't have the room to actually be able to grow food. And it has a lot of other benefits as well, because when you grow in a container, you have the ability to then adapt what you're growing to the conditions that you have. So, if you wanted to, for instance, have a vegetable garden, but your entire backyard was shaded, it would be difficult to actually grow vegetables in the ground in those conditions. But you could put a few pots on your front step or even close to your house where it gets more sun, and that would allow you to, say, grow tomatoes. Or if you had, the shade in the garden that happened to be from a black walnut tree, you definitely could not grow those tomatoes in the ground, because black walnuts and tomatoes just don't get along. So, and the other reason is just, families are busy. So tending a garden tends to be perceived as, and rightly so, a fair amount of work, because you've got to weed, you've got to manage it, you've got to water it. Not to say that you don't have to do that with a container, but you do. But because it's a small contained space, you can, for a family of 4, maybe have, a half dozen containers, still get tomatoes and peppers and zucchini and the few things that you need, and it's not going to require the investment of time that, say, a full vegetable garden would require. So lots of reasons to grow in containers. And here's, I wanted to put this in because this is everyone's idea of what a traditional vegetable garden kind of looks like, right? It's, a nice big, huge area. This one's got a great view. I don't know if this is Monticello or not. I don't think it is, but it could be. Everything's in rows, and you have to spend, hours every day hoeing the weeds in between all the rows, and, everything's kind of, and it's huge. It takes up acres. That's kind of the traditional vegetable garden. This would be grandma's vegetable, well, not my grandparents, but I mean, for those of you who do have or did have grandparents who grew up, say, here in North America, where there's lots of space, this would be a typical of that generation of what the vegetable garden. Few of us have the space or the time to invest in that. So here's what I call the new gardening style. I mean, it's really about just going and finding some pots, some containers, whatever you happen to have handy, get some soil in it and put some seeds down, and you can grow. You're not going to grow an entire family, for the winter type of thing that our grandparents used to do, enough food to put down, but you're going to have enough fresh vegetables to at least put a few meals on the table during the summer. And, what kid doesn't love running over and grabbing a ripe cherry tomato off of a tomato plant? I mean, my granddaughter already, loves it. She's 15 months. She sees cherry tomatoes and she just can't keep her fingers off of them. So a great way to introduce kids to gardening and to fresh fruit and vegetables. So let's talk about what are some of the things you need to get started. So, a little bit about vegetables, and you've got a few containers, but you don't have any idea how to start. So I'm going to go really down to basics to help everybody to just kind of figure out what are the most important things to consider when you want to do this. So the first thing, of course, is to choose your container. And let me tell you, the choice is limitless. You can use almost anything that you have kicking around your house or your garage, or you can go to, a box store, buy some of those, buckets, those 5-gallon buckets or whatever they have. You can buy storage bins. There's an example here of a grocery bag that's been converted, shall we say. And, some people just have old clay pots hanging around. So, there's always that traditional option of using clay. So really, the choice is limitless. Bigger is always better. If you're going to grow things like tomatoes, and the smaller the pot, the more often you're watering it, and the more restrictive the roots are actually going to be. So you want to kind of adapt, and I talk a little bit about that. You want to adapt your container to the plants you're going to grow in it. Certainly, a small shallow dish is great for things like lettuces and very shallow rooted plants. But if you want to grow things like carrots or potatoes, you're going to need a big container, and it's going to have to be deep enough to allow those roots to develop. You can even use hanging baskets, window boxes, teapots, old boots. You can be as creative as you want when it comes to picking the containers that you want to use in your garden. So, be creative and have fun with it. So, the one rule that you absolutely should not break when it comes to growing vegetables in containers is you have to make sure they have holes in the bottom for drainage. So the one thing that plants do not, most plants, I mean, except for those that are kind of, boggy type plants anyway, the one thing that they do not like is standing water at the base around their roots. So holes are important. So if you're buying just, bins from Canadian Tire, hopefully you've got somebody who's got a drill and you can just, put some holes in. If not, go get yourself some kind of a really good sized nail and make sure that you can hammer some good sized holes into the bottom. And an electric drill obviously is the best option for doing that. Okay, so drainage is important. You need to make sure that there's no standing water. So the next thing that I get asked a lot is, what kind of soil mix should I use in my containers? Every garden center, if you can still get them, that is, every garden center carries what are called soilless mixes. They're usually labeled as a potting mix or a container mix, and they're almost always peat moss based, so they don't actually have any true soil in them. They're peat moss based, and they have other additives like vermiculite and perlite, and usually they have a bit of a base fertilizer in them, and there may be, depending on the mix, so you can get a mix for cactus plants that'll have a bit of sand or grit in it to provide good drainage and a bit more weight as well. But a general all-purpose potting mix or container mix, because sometimes they're specifically made for containers, or a mix that is specifically made for growing vegetables in containers, and you can actually get those. And I have a couple of examples. You can make your own if you're somebody who really, as you can see here in the photo of the bag there, they're showing some different additives that can be added in. There's recipes that you can go out on Google, and you can go Google up recipes, and there's all sorts of different recipes that have different additives. Some of those additives, like lime or kelp or some other things, might be a bit more difficult to find. So my recommendation is just go and buy bags of container soil. And so I'll show you. Here's a couple. So I just went and did a quick search on the internet and said, okay, show me what's available. I'm not saying that, these are ones that I recommend. They're just ones that are available. So you can get, as you can see, ones that are specifically made for vegetables and fruits or flowers and herbs, or there's an organic, if you're someone who prefers organic, you can always get the organic choice. So, there really is a lot of choice out there, but just a basic potting mix is all you really need. Don't use ordinary garden soil. Okay, so this bag, you can buy that, and a lot of places like the super centers sell what they call black earth, I think, for about $2 a bag. Don't use that. Okay, and that's actually meant for using in your garden as an additive or amendment to garden soil, but it's not something you want to use in a container. Soil is made out of 3 components, which is clay, silt, and sand. And in the ground, it is naturally aerated by a lot of different insect and worm life that is constantly moving through it. Roots move into it, they die, they leave spaces, animals burrow into it. And so there's always a bunch of ecological processes that are going on that are making sure air is staying and that air is moving around in the soil, because air is a very important component. When you put that soil into a container and water it, and especially in heat like this, some of my containers I'm watering twice a day. What happens is the water moves through and the soil starts to compact, and you end up with a solid mass of soil around the roots, and you're eventually going to choke them off. So don't use garden soil. Use one of the soilless mixes. You can use a bit of garden soil as an amendment, and I've done that when I've grown potatoes in pots, but it's a very small percentage of the total mixture, and whatever else is in there is making sure that there's enough water and air movement around the roots. So I would just avoid using garden soil altogether. Okay, so we have a container. We've got a bag of soil. What do you want to grow? That's the next big decision, right? So now you need to choose what vegetables you want to grow. A couple of considerations that you need to think about. What do you like to eat? Because, if you're somebody who doesn't really like kale, there's no point in growing it unless you like it just for its decorative value. So that's always where I advise people to start. Think about what it is that you eat. Look at your grocery cart when you go to the grocery store. What are you buying? Are you buying lettuce and cherry tomatoes and cucumbers? Then, that's a great place to start, right? Or, as you can see on this one side here, we have, kind of a family list. You can poll the family and say, okay, list your favorite vegetable, and then you can kind of start that way. Or, if you don't know, you can also go back to your friend Google and say, oh, what are the top 10 beginner plants? And you can, every list I've seen is different. So depending on what region you happen to be looking in, you could come up with a slightly different list. So that's a great way to choose your vegetables. Kind of start with what you already eat. And then I would recommend that you try something new, something that you haven't grown or eaten before. Maybe, just to be because, a package of seeds or a couple of plants at a garden center are not expensive. So, choose your own adventure and try something totally different. And I've got some, as I say, I've got some ideas at the end. So gardening is a journey, and, start small, easy steps, and build on your success. And I'm going to say the same thing that I do for all of the other gardening seminars. Keep a journal. Keep some kind of a log of what you grew, what you planted, when you planted it, and regardless, success or failure, log it down, because next year when you come back to your garden and you want to try again, you want to go back and look at what was it that I tried to grow? What do I know what went wrong? And if you don't, then you can always contact the Master Gardeners, because we can help you out. And then next year you'll be more successful again, and you're constantly building on that, because gardening it's a lifelong journey. So, you learn from both your successes and your mistakes. So I've done a little bit of work here looking at some vegetable varieties for containers specifically. And the thing to do if you're growing in containers is to look for vegetable varieties that have been specifically bred to be grown in smaller spaces or containers. And trust me, there's lots. Some examples, I went to so I grabbed one of my seed catalogs, and I'm just going to show you. So this happens to be Vessie's. It says seeds on it, right? Good. Vessie's Seeds is a Canadian seed company based out of Prince Edward Island. Their catalog is online, so that's a great place to start. We also have the Ontario Seed Company, and they're the ones that put a lot of their seed displays in the big box stores. You'll usually see those in Canadian Tire. Mackenzie Seed out of Manitoba is usually in the box stores as well. So we have lots of Canadian seed companies and lots of choice of places where you can go and buy. So, the extra twist for us is that we also want short season, because we don't necessarily have the same kind of growing season as people who live to the south of us in some of the warmer US states. But when you're looking for containers, look for those things that are specifically meant to be grown there. So I looked up tomato tumbling Tom, and the quote in the seed catalog was, "It's the best variety for hanging baskets." So, you know, just imagine taking a hanging basket and converting it and having tomatoes tumbling out of it. I mean, that sounds just totally amazing. I actually want to try that now. A pea called Sugar Sprint, which is an early and compact plant. So that's another key word to look for, compact. Because a compact plant is one that will grow well in a container. It's not going to kind of ramble and sprawl. A pepper called Redskin, which was described as the perfect pepper for container gardening. So lots of pieces of information available in the seed catalogs. Certainly, if you were to go and look at the racks that they put in the box stores like Canadian Tire, Home Depot, even the Supercenter, I think, sells some seeds. You know, read the back of the package. You know, how big does the plant get? Usually they also describe on there how many days to harvest. So, you know, at this point of the season, if you're growing something from seed, you don't want something that's going to take 100 days to harvest. You probably want something with, you know, like a short 45 or 55 days, something like that. So you might need to do a little research, visit the stores, visit nurseries and garden centers, ask your gardening friends, ask the Master Gardeners. I mean, there's lots of places you can get recommendations for specific varieties of a vegetable that you want to grow. So, just going back a bit more to help you as you're getting ready to plant, understanding a bit more about vegetables. There are a number of different ways that we divide vegetables up that will also help you in understanding how to grow them. Sorry, I've been out most of the day and I'm probably dehydrated. So, cool and warm season, and that's an important consideration. And whether it's something that needs full sun, which is usually a minimum of 6 hours of sunlight a day, or whether it can take part shade. And usually there's a bit of a relationship between the two, so we'll talk about that. Cool season plants are typically your leafy greens, like lettuces, kale, spinach, arugula, all of the mâché, the mesclun mixes. Those generally do really well during what I call the shoulder seasons, so spring and fall. I've got a couple of planters now with some baby lettuce in it, and most of the time they're just like drooped right down because they just don't do well in this kind of heat. So leafy greens, root vegetables are certainly cool season vegetables as well. You can usually start those fairly early in the season, and again, they do better during those seasons or during the times when it's a bit cooler. So the cool season plants, not all of them, but most of them are also a bit frost hardy. So things like kale, for instance, if you were to seed it in your garden as early as April, even if we had night frost, it wouldn't actually kill the plant. Whereas if you put a tomato out in April, it'll be stone dead. So, you know, that's kind of the difference. They have an ability to withstand a certain, I mean, certainly if we had a killer frost, that would be different. But usually that time of the year, we're only getting mild frost, you know, like -4, -5, and those plants are pretty good at withstanding that kind of frost. The frost-tender vegetables, of course, can't take frost, but they also don't like cold soil, so that's really the big difference. And peas, another great vegetable that you can grow. You can be sowing that in April as well and get an early crop before the end of April, sometimes even into early May. So, you know, those are great plants to grow. Oh, and the great thing about growing any of these cool season plants in containers, if you put your containers out in a sunny spot in your garden, even if it's April, the soil in that container is, number one, it's going to dry up, it's going to warm up much more quickly. So you can actually have an advantage over those of us who are actually gardening in the ground, in that you can probably get some stuff started. And because they're portable, if you're going to have frost and you happen to have something that's a little more tender, you need to move it into just a warm spot overnight, and then you can put it back out during the day. So that's a great thing with growing things in pots, because you can get an early start on the gardening season. So what are the leafy greens? There's all kinds of them. There's that, shopping bag again. So arugula, which has a wonderful kind of a nutty, sometimes a bit of a heat, a bit of a bite to it. It's great in a salad mix. It's great in a salad by itself with certain ingredients. Leaf lettuce, endive, spinach, Swiss chard, kale, mustard, mache, cress, and of course all of the Chinese greens. We've only got baby bok choy listed here, but there's Chinese cabbage, there's pak choy, there's all sorts of, and they're almost all members of the cabbage family, so they all do well in the early season, and they're great to grow in containers because they're the perfect size. I mean, they're not deep. Most of them are fairly shallowly rooted, and I just love the look of a whole pattern of different kinds of greens, and I've seen them done in some containers where you have red and green lettuce, and sometimes arugula or rocket, or even a bit of, say, fennel in there that's a bit more frothy looking, and it can look just like a well-designed floral container. I mean, because you're getting lots of interesting foliage in it. And of course, how stunning is that wonderful Italian dinosaur kale, or whatever that stuff is called. I mean, it's just, it's wonderful stuff. It's that blue color, and, it looks great in a garden. One of the things that I should mention here, because these are cool season plants, and if you're growing them in the spring, of course, during the summer, they're going to go a bit dormant. What I'm planning to do now, because we're almost in mid-July, I'm planning to start some seeds. I'll start them here inside for things that I want to put out in the garden in mid-August. So by about mid-August, I think some of my summer squash plants like zucchini will be probably finishing. They tend to get powdery mildew, and they've done blooming by then, and I want to replace them with a different crop. So I'm going to start those plants that will take me well into the fall and even into early winter. Kale is certainly one of those plants. Spinach is another plant that will do that. Swiss chard. So those are all things that I'm going to start seeding in the next few weeks. So what you want to think about when you're growing leafy greens is to do what we call succession sowing, which is to do maybe a different sowing 2 weeks later, so that you always have some fresh green throughout the season. You're not just doing one crop. So that's something else that's fairly easy to do in containers. And as I mentioned, you can think about combining different greens together, and I've got, as I said, I've got some examples here at the end that I can show you. And there's some herbs that you can combine with that as well, but I don't want to steal thunder from my fellow master gardener who's going to do a talk on herbs next week, so you'll have to tune in for that one. So here are the root vegetables that you can start. Radishes are a great one. They're great for sowing in the garden early. Carrots, potatoes, and beets, as well as onions, can all go in the garden fairly early. Onions, you can usually buy in bags called sets, so they're little tiny onion bulbs, and you just set them out in the garden or into your pots in this case. I have, because we're redoing my entire vegetable garden this year, my entire crop of potatoes is in containers. So I have, they're called grow bags, and they're a great option for growing potatoes in. I happen to have the ones that come from Home Hardware. And you can roll the sides down, put a little bit of your potting soil in, your potting mix, your seed potatoes, cover them up a bit, and when they start to grow and the foliage gets to be about, I would say, 10, 15 centimeters high, you can sow the next bunch of seed potatoes in there, cover those up. And I usually don't do more than 2. Sometimes I will do 3. If they're really small potatoes, I might do 3 layers, but usually for bigger potatoes, I do 2 layers, and then keep topping them up until the bag is like at least 3/4 full of soil. And then, you know, as they're growing, rolling the sides back up until the sides are all the way up. And I think the foliage on mine must be 4 feet high at the moment. So, you know, a grow bag is a great way to grow potatoes, because I've actually done potatoes in the soil, and this is way easier because all I have to do is tip the whole thing over when it's done, and I don't have to do any digging. What's not to like about that? Beets, of course, and again, with beets, that might be something that you want to think about doing succession sowing on. Same with carrots, especially if you choose some of the smaller varieties of carrots. And if you have young children, you will know that kids will, they will go and they'll pull the carrot up just to see if the carrot is growing yet. So, you know, you might want to make sure you have some extra seeds around, because they are curious. And of course, you know, what great way to teach kids, you know, where their food comes from, rather, you know, have them kind of pull it up and look at it. Of course, carrots won't grow as well, but, you know, what the heck. So, what else? Carrots, you can choose short-rooted cultivars like Nantes, Orange Rocket. I think there's one called Little Finger or Scarlet Nantes. And these ones are about, their harvest time is about 60 days. So that's from time of germination, I think, to the time they're ready to harvest. Radishes can be grown in containers that are as little as 8 inches deep. So, you know, radishes are a great thing to put in if you have more shallow containers. So there's certainly some things you can do. And beets, there are things like Baby Gladiator, Early Wonder. I have some that I'm growing that are called Dutch Baby Ball, I think, or something like that, or Ruby Ball or something. They're very tiny red beets. So, you know, there's lots of choice for, again, smaller versions of these root vegetables as well. And of course, if you want to grow potatoes in containers, you're not limited necessarily by the size of the potato. Anybody have any questions along the way? Feel free to shout out, put something on in the chat box.
Yeah, I have
You have some questions. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So when you're talking about planting seed potatoes, how do you know you can, like, the potato is ready to be planted, that it'll actually grow for you?
So the trick that I do with my seed potatoes is a process called chitting, which is, as opposed to something else, chitting. And chitting potatoes basically means you take those. So I just buy bags of seed, you know, I bought some seed potatoes in bags from Vandermeer in the spring, and I think I bought a couple of bags from Canadian Tire as well, because Canadian Tire has certain commonly grown varieties like Yukon Gold, Red Pontiacs, and Kennebecs, whereas at Vandermeer I can get some of the interesting European varieties that you just don't see in a box store. So I bought some, I think they're Russian blues. So not only is the skin of the potato blue, but the flesh is blue. I've never grown a blue potato before, so I'm venturing out here. I'm trying to imagine what blue mashed potatoes are going to be like to eat, but anyway, we'll find that out. Some French fingerlings and a couple of Dutch varieties. One's called Prince of Orange and another one I don't remember the name of. So anyway, I was talking about chitting. So I saved, you know, those egg trays that you get when you buy like 30 eggs or something? I have a bunch of those that I just keep stacked at the back of my garden shed. I took the potatoes out of the bags, put them in there, and I put them on the shelf where I also happen to, you know, put my seeds. But even if you just put them close to a window so they're exposed to any kind of sunlight, the eyes on them will actually start to develop, and you'll start to actually see, you know, kind of where the growth is going to come off the potato. And if you do that for about 2 weeks and then put them in the pot that you're going to plant them in, that will develop into leaves and roots fairly quickly. So that's how you know those, you know, and if it doesn't, obviously if those eyes don't develop, then, you know, that potato's not going to grow. But, you know, I've had no problem. And even potatoes, I know that people like to do this. Sometimes you have potatoes that are left over in a corner of your, you know, cupboard or whatever that have started getting shoots on them. You could grow those. You could totally do it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. That's great.
Okay, you're welcome. All right, another cold, cool season plant are peas. And as you can see, there's a number of different ways you can grow them. Regular varieties of peas, of course, pea is a climbing plant and it needs some kind of a trellis system to grow on. You can use bamboo poles tied together, or you can buy varieties let me see, I went and looked up a few. One's actually called peas in a pot. That was one variety of a shelling pea that I think I found. There's one called Super Sugar Snap, Sugar Daddy. So there's a couple of varieties that seem to be smaller plants. But even if it's just a regular variety of pea, I mean, it's not difficult to put it in a pot, put some bamboo poles, and actually train, and they will climb up by themselves. And so, you know, it's a fairly easy plant to grow. What's great about peas, of course, like beans and a lot of other legumes in that family, is that they actually fix their own nitrogen in the soil. So you don't really need to worry about fertilizing these guys because they have the ability to actually take nitrogen out of the air and fix it around their roots. So it's the great part about growing peas and beans in pots, and I will talk about fertilizing in a bit, but you don't need to worry about fertilizing these because they do it themselves. You still maybe want to add some potassium or phosphorus if you want to, but you don't really need to. They're good at kind of taking care of that. Some people like to pre-soak them before they plant them. You know, I usually don't bother. I stick them in the soil, and as long as you keep the soil moist while they're germinating, you don't really need to soak them ahead of time. I already talked about the support they need. So enough of the cool season plants. Let's move on to warm season because these are some of the really delicious plants. Beans, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, cucumbers, squashes, any kind of pumpkin or any kind of melon. These are all warm season plants. What does that mean? It means that they are frost tender. They will not take frost. And they need the soil to be at a certain temperature before they actually start growing. I know there are a lot of people that will go out to garden centers because the garden centers stock their stuff ahead of time, and they will actually go out to the garden centers in, early May and buy tomato plants. But if you take those tomato plants, regardless of covering them up and protecting them from frost, the ground is cold and they will simply not grow. And it's been demonstrated that, people who've planted their tomatoes early in May, even if they did protect them from any late frosts, and people who planted at, say, the end of May, and within less than a month, the plants that have been planted later have caught up to the ones that were planted earlier because they really go dormant in cold soil. They don't like it. And it's the same for beans. You put bean seeds into soil that's cold, they won't grow. Trust me, I can tell you this because I've tried it. So again, learn from your mistakes. I've made lots over the years, so you're benefiting from all the mistakes that I've made. So warm season plants should usually be planted well after all risk of frost is past, and that's usually in this part of Southern Ontario. We use kind of the May 2-4 weekend as our rule of thumb for doing that. I think our frost-free date is actually closer to May 15th, but I've been around long enough to know that we've had frost as late as the last week in May, and I've actually been on the Victoria Day weekend up to my parents' cottage, and we had snow. So, the weather can be a bit wacky, so I always tell people for these vegetables, just wait until June 1st. The extra week is going to allow the soil to warm up, and it's just going to be that much safer to make sure that there's no risk of frost. The great part about, as I mentioned earlier, about warm season plants and planting them in containers is that you can be well ahead of this curve. If you can make sure that the soil in your container is warming up in the nice sunshine during the day, then you might be able to start a week or two earlier than most other people, but the only thing you have to worry about is the temperatures at night. So if they are going to dip down below, say, 5 Celsius, you want to make sure that if you have any of these tender plants in pots that you're putting them, you're either bringing them into the house, you're covering them up with a frost blanket or plastic or something to make sure that they're not going to be damaged by the cool temperatures. So, but it does give you that advantage of being able to start some of these plants a little bit earlier. A lot of these plants you do not want to be starting from seed this late in the season though, because they typically have long harvest cycles. So for instance, the tomatoes that I planted in my garden, I think I started the seed in late March or early April, because the seed package is a great place to look for information. They'll usually say 6 to 8 weeks. So you want to make sure that you have a seedling that's already a fairly good size that you're going to put into a pot before June the 1st. So you don't want to be starting a seed June the 1st because our season is not long enough. You'll be getting tomatoes, green tomatoes in September, and there won't be enough what we call heat days left to ripen that fruit. So you really want to make sure that you start those earlier. Same with eggplant and peppers. Okay.
There was just a question about cucumbers.
Yeah.
So someone had tried cucumbers, but now there's fungus that's come on the top of the soil.
In terms of growing inside from seed, you're seeing a little bit of fungus on the soil. That happens, and it's warm, humid conditions. A lot of moisture. And so what I would recommend is, depending on what size the container is that you're growing the cucumber in, let it dry out at the top. So you might want to just, let that top layer of soil actually go completely dry. If you're watering it and it's constantly moist, you got a better chance of getting a fungus. The other thing you can do is maybe put a small layer of sand on top, because that'll help to dry it out and get rid of the fungus as well. Okay.
Awesome. And I know Tracy had mentioned in the chat that you had tomatoes last year that didn't ripen in time before frost, and you had planted them in the beginning of June. So was that from seed, or did you plant the starter? The little guys that you were just talking about, Ingrid?
I bought little starter plants, and I had tons of tomatoes, and none of them ripened.
we all had a bad summer with tomatoes last year. Trust me, you weren't the only one.
Okay,
so
me.
you were exactly. I mean, I had more green tomatoes than I've ever had in my garden, and I hardly got any, ripe ones off. It was just one of those wonky summers where I don't know if we just didn't have enough sun. We didn't have enough. Well, last year, if I remember correctly, I still had ice in my garden in the 3rd week of May, because we had so much ice and snow. It took forever for the ground to warm up. And if there's one thing that tomatoes really don't like, it's cold soil. They will sulk for a month. And the problem is they did that, and then they finally took off. By the time they got tomatoes, it was already late August. So, we were all sitting there with green tomatoes last year. In a normal summer, and I'm telling you, my tomato plants already have small tomatoes on them, and I started those seeds, I'm sure it was the 1st week of April, and brought them out to start hardening them off at some point in May. I think I ended up carrying trays in and out of the house, I don't know how many times, because we had risk of frost so many times during late May. But I finally got them planted out into the containers probably sometime in June, because my garden was undergoing renovation, and they're doing fine now. I mean, I have a lot of flower. I don't have a lot of fruit on them yet, but I have a lot of flower. So I'm hoping that, in a few more weeks, I'll start seeing some good-sized tomatoes. Fingers crossed. Okay. You can grow beans in pots as well, and I mentioned with peas that, again, this is one of those great nitrogen fixing plants. Same thing, you have the choice between bush beans and pole beans. If you want pole beans, then you need to put poles or some kind of a trellis system into your container. You can see, somebody got very elaborate with some storage bins and some, metal cages around them, and, four bean plants in a container. So, like I said, you can be pretty flexible. And I managed to find a picture of a bush bean growing in a window box hanging on the side of a balcony, and I thought that was really, really cool. And look at those gorgeous beans. So, you can literally grow bean plants almost anywhere. They don't transplant well. And this I can say from more recent experience, because I actually thought it was going to be smart. I was going to be smart by starting some beans early. And I had bought what are called deep-rooted trays, thinking, well, if, I know they don't like their roots disturbed, but, these deep-rooted trays, and I'll be able to move them. Yeah, no. What happens when you grow beans inside, even with any kind of grow lights, they get really long and leggy really fast. And I've got stems that are like, floppy and, anyway, it's been not a successful experiment, shall we say. So beans should be seeded directly in your pots or into your containers. Grow them in a fair, it has to be a 3-gallon container or larger. I would say, a good 50 centimeters and at least 30 centimeters deep. For people who go in inches, you want to make sure that it's at least, I would say 16 inches wide and a good 12 inches deep, because they're big plants. They're gonna need some room. So you can probably, depending on, again, the variety, you might be able to stuff a couple of plants into one container. And certainly if it's a pole or a climbing type, you can take a pot like that and put 4 in, because they're really going to just climb right up the poles. But if it's a bush type, then it's going to take up a little bit more real estate in your pot. Some very cool variety, like I showed earlier. There's the purple potted beans, which are a very cool variety. When you actually cook them, they turn green, which is interesting. And I haven't tried these myself, but I think I have some seed kicking around for these. I think they're called snake beans. And I think the beans are easily 2 feet long. So, there's some really interesting, they're an Asian bean. There's certainly some very interesting ones. I have one called Dragon's Tongue, I think, which has some interesting kind of flamey flares on the side of it. Some of them, again, shelling beans or fresh eating beans. It's your choice depending on, the foods that you like to eat. Okay, tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers. These are usually, tomatoes anyway, are probably the most commonly grown container plant, I would say. And it's easy enough to do if you get one of the smaller varieties. I have a very interesting cherry tomato type that I think I got from Renee's Seeds that's called Little Bites. There's another one called Isis Candy. I think it's a bigger plant, but the Little Bites is actually a compact plant, and it gets nice little cherry-sized or grape-sized tomatoes on it. So, that's something that's easy enough to put into just an ordinary little pot that you can keep on your front step by your back doors, that you can, just go past it and pick tomato, or the kids can just go past it and pick tomatoes as they go. And there are dwarf and compact eggplants as well. There's eggplants that are called dragon's eggs. They're actually, tiny little white, very, very cool little eggplants. So there's all kinds of really interesting varieties. There's one that we did for one of the community gardens we did a few years ago that I think is a Korean red eggplant. So go look at some seed catalogs. You can get some really cool things. And of course, if you're a pepper person, the peppers, some people like really, really, really hot peppers, and the only way you're ever going to get those is to grow your own. Because, they sell habaneros or Scotch bonnets in the supermarkets. And now I'm starting to see the little Thai peppers in the supermarkets as well. So, but, if you're really into the very hot stuff, like the Trinidad Scorpion and some other ones, those are ones that you're generally going to have to go and find the seeds for. and grow them yourself. So moving on. Those are, I think they're Chinese eggplants, and they're those, you can see those, you often see them in the supermarket, but you know, again, it's a really cool vegetable to grow in a container. And you know, what's better than having beautiful red peppers growing in a red pot? I mean, you know, it just looks so cool. Okay, cucumbers, melons, pumpkins, and squash. These can be a little trickier, especially if you're dealing with fruits that are going to, like squash or pumpkins, that are going to get kind of heavy. Certainly, cucumbers are typically vining plants as well, so they need support. I'm growing for the first time this year a climbing zucchini, which is an Italian climbing zucchini. They're actually very cool shaped as well. I've used, because I have raised beds in my garden, I've used kind of a metal trellis that I've put up in kind of a teepee shape, and I'm allowing them to grow up. They do need help, so I'm kind of tying them along the way. They do have tendrils, but they need a little help to get going. What you need to worry about with some of the bigger fruits like the melons and the squash, of course, is that if you're growing it up a trellis and it sets fruit, you're going to have to create some kind of a sling to support the weight of the fruit on the vine, because it won't be able to hold it. As that fruit matures, it won't be able to hold it. What people often do is they just take a piece of pantyhose and they kind of tie it up, anything, you know, a piece of cloth, if you happen to have an old t-shirt that you want to rip apart, and create kind of some kind of a sling that you can actually tie to your trellis that will hold the weight of that fruit. And I would recommend that you kind of stay with melons and squashes that really don't get too large. So you don't want to go for, say, you know, a full-size pumpkin. You might want to do maybe mini ones or delicata squashes or things like that that aren't going to require a huge amount of support if you want to actually grow them up a trellis. What else? A sling made from pantyhose or a mesh bag. We talked about that. And the melons as well. All of these plants, and I haven't mentioned that, all of these plants require full sun. So in order for the fruit to actually ripen, they're going to need a good amount of sunlight per day. So if you don't get it in one spot in your garden, you might, you know, for your zucchini, you might want to have it on wheels so you can move it around on your deck or your balcony or your terrace or whatever to make sure it gets enough sunlight during the day.
So when you do pumpkin, can you actually grow it from like your pumpkin in the fall and save the seeds and then plant it in the spring? Or
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've done it when I used to buy, you know, pie pumpkins or whatever. I haven't been growing pumpkins for a while because I've got lots of places around here where I can actually go out and buy a couple of pumpkins. They take up a lot of real estate, but you can absolutely save, if you're, you know, cleaning out your pumpkins for your kids for Halloween or for putting on your front step anyway, just save some seeds. You might have to, you know, kind of give them a bit of a wash. What I do is I'll wash them a bit in like a colander or something, and then just wipe them because there's kind of stuff on them. Just wipe that between 2 sheets of paper towel, and then lay them out on a fresh piece of paper towel to dry. Find a small envelope, label it, and store them in a, you know, cool, dry place until spring. Sure. You can do it for butternut squash that you buy in the store, or any other squash you buy in the store. You can do that as well. Mm-hmm.
And we just, sorry, I missed a question about peppers. Hina had said that, was wondering, she just got white flowers on their peppers and was wondering how many months it took for them to grow. The green peppers.
A green pepper, I wonder, hang on. Let me just go back in my notes. I think peppers are like I'm going to actually look it up on the fly here because I happen to have the catalog right in front of me. So let me just see if I can find you a date for pumpkins, peppers here. For a regular green, like a green California green wonder, one of those types. Okay, let me just tell you. So the bigger the pepper, the longer it would actually take. Tomcat. Here's a pepper called Tomcat. Where are you? Extra large bell peppers, 75 to 80 days, and that's to red. So with a green pepper, you're actually picking it before it ripens because they ripen as sweet red peppers. But green, so you're picking it a bit earlier. So it could be about 2 months. So you'll be picking it, if it's just flowering now, you'll be picking it in early September.
Nice.
Okay. Any other questions on cucumbers and squash and pumpkins growing? I have a really cute, I should have brought one with me. I have a really cute zucchini that I'm growing this year called 8-ball, and it's a zucchini that's perfectly round. It's actually very cool. Yeah, they get to be, you're supposed to pick them when they're about 3 inches in size. Yeah, they're, I've never done a completely round zucchini before, so it's actually just, there's so much cool stuff that you can actually grow. Okay, no more questions about vegetables. I want to move on to watering and fertilizing, and it's all, I realize it's already 8 o'clock, and I said, you know, I might not take the entire time. I lied. But it's, so watering and fertilizing. First, let me just give you some general, well, I'll just talk about it a little bit. Plants in containers are going to dry out more quickly depending on the conditions, and certainly the weather we've had for the last couple of weeks, they're drying out to the point where, as I mentioned, I'm watering twice a day. So heat and wind are certainly a combination that are going to make sure that they dry out, as well as the type of material that your container is made out of. So if you choose to grow in clay pots, remember that clay is porous and it will dry out even more quickly. So plastic is great. Any kind of material like plastic bins will allow the water to, excuse me, I'm drinking sparkling water and it's just upsetting me. It will allow the water to stay in the pot for a longer period of time. Clay allows that to actually transpire out. I'm looking at my soil bags that I have that I'm growing my potatoes in, and the edges of them seem to get dry fairly quickly, but you know, I can actually put my fingers in and I can feel that there's still moisture in the soil. So maybe that type of plastic weave allows it to get a little dry at the edges as well. So you need to make sure they have consistent moisture, and this is especially true for tomatoes, because tomatoes are prone to a condition called blossom end rot. And what that is when the fruit starts to set, you'll actually notice that where the flower was attached at the base of the fruit, there will actually get to be a sunken lesion, and eventually it'll turn black and that tomato will rot away. And it's a shortage of calcium, and a lot of people, you'll see a lot of stuff on the internet about, oh, put eggshells in. Calcium in eggshells is not in a form that's accessible by plants, so it really doesn't do anything. And while we know it's a calcium shortage, it's calcium not getting into the plant tissue, not that it isn't available in the soil. So consistent watering is the right answer. Don't allow your plants to actually show signs of wilting, because that's just not good for them. Do allow the surface, so that's, I would say, you know, the top maybe couple of centimeters of soil to get a little bit dry before you water again. But I mean, that's happening fairly quickly. As I say, it happens in my garden. It literally happens during the day. So you need to be watering again. So I water in the morning and I'm watering again in the late afternoon or early evening. So you can buy what are called sub-irrigated or self-watering containers. That way, especially if you work during the day or you don't think you're going to get to a regular watering schedule, there are things that you can do that can help you. You can, you know, if you really want to get sophisticated, you can sort of set up a container with these little hoses that go off to your individual plants that water them for you. You know, if you're an engineer, you might want to think about that. Or you could do one of these. This is actually making your own sub-irrigated, what they call a sub-irrigated planter. And as you can see, you know, you take a container, you put some holes in a piece of PVC pipe, you put another pipe that's upright, you put some drainage material in the bottom, because again, you don't want the roots of the plant to be sitting in water, because this bin does not have drainage holes in it. The drainage holes are actually in the pipe. So you want to put some gravel or something down where that layer of water can sit, and then you put your soil on top, and the water seeps up from that bottom layer of rock up into your soil and provides a constant source of moisture. That's what we call a sub-irrigated planter. And you can see that someone has done the same with, say, some, you know, buckets. You can do the same kind of system with a couple of buckets as well. And these are things that you can easily find on the internet. You can Google them. There's all kinds of interesting plans for going and making your own if you need some way of making sure that your plants stay well watered during the day if you're not going to be able to be at home to do that. The one thing I haven't talked about is fertilizing, and as I mentioned at the beginning, you're using a soilless mix. It's not garden soil, so it doesn't have any natural nutrient value in it. The nutrient value is very low. Sometimes the mixes will have a certain amount of fertilizer in them at the beginning, but because of the regular watering, you're flushing that stuff out pretty quickly. So you do need to fertilize most of the plants that you're growing in containers, especially things like fruiting plants, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. And I generally recommend fertilizing every 2 weeks. The choice of fertilizer is completely up to you. Here's some options. Water soluble fertilizer is generally best because, you know, if you're using some kind of a watering can, there's directions on the back of the container that tell you how much to mix with how much water, and that way you're making sure that your plants are getting just the right amount of fertilizer. And the choice is up to you. It can be an organic one, you can do a fish-based one if that's your thing. You can get hen manure. That is usually in particles that you actually mix in with your soil, and then you would water that in, and organic if that's your choice. It doesn't really matter as long as it's something that's formulated. You know, you can go to a very basic 10-10-10 formula, that's an all-purpose, or you can actually go to ones that are specifically designed to be for tomatoes, vegetables, and fruits, which are typically the last two numbers are usually higher, because you don't want a lot of nitrogen because that produces green leaves. You want the other ingredients, which are potassium, phosphorus, and potassium, because that helps to flowering and the setting of fruit. Okay, so I think that's it for fertilizer.
Can I ask one question? Do you need to put in new potting soil each year, or if you're going to do the fertilizer, can you just keep the same soil and you fertilize every 2 weeks? And
so you can reuse your potting soil, but I wouldn't leave the same lump of soil in a pot and just reuse that. So here's what I would do. Take your potting soil, if you've just left it in your pot from last year. If you have a wheelbarrow, great. If you don't, just have a plastic container, empty that pot into it and mix it with fresh potting mixture. So you want to make sure that you're not just using it the way it was, that you're adding more fresh perlite, vermiculite, all that stuff into it, and kind of breaking it up a little bit, because they do tend to compact a bit. And because it's peat moss based, and one of the things that I find with peat moss is, especially if it's been sitting a year, it gets ultra dry, and it makes it really hard for water to be absorbed. So by mixing it up, breaking it up, and mixing it with fresh soil, you're actually making it much more friable. But you can reuse it, absolutely.
okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So what I decided to do in the last part of this presentation was just to talk a little bit about container design, because that's something we typically do when we do a talk on containers, especially when it's, like flowers. And so, has everybody heard the kind of the container rule of thumb, the thriller, the filler, and the spiller? I mean, and there's all kinds of other things you want to do. You want to have different types of foliage, different colors of flowers. So container design for flowers, there's all kinds of interesting ways that we discuss it, but why not switch it up when you're talking about vegetables and make containers based on the way you cook? So I did a little bit of research on this, and I thought, well, why not? There's some ideas for, creating containers based on, some favorite family recipes, or your favorite restaurant dinner, or a vacation that you had, or things that you want to try and cook at home. So grouping plants according to, a particular type of food or cooking, and make sure that you're grouping those vegetables together that have similar growing conditions. And I'll kind of talk about that really quickly. Make sure that you're choosing containers that are, as I said earlier, a minimum of, say, 50 to 60 centimeters wide and 30 centimeters deep to accommodate enough soil that you're providing enough growing space for everything that you're putting in it, and have some fun. So I've got some ideas. The first one I called Memories of Mexico. So this is a salsa verde planter. So if you have ever been to Mexico, or if you've been to a Mexican restaurant and you've enjoyed Mexican food, salsa verde is the green salsa that they often serve. It's a staple dish in Mexican cuisine, and it's based on a fruit which is called a tomatillo, which is it's kind of a distant cousin of the tomato. It's actually more closely related to a garden plant called the Chinese lantern, which has these little orange paper lanterns in them because it has that little paper husk that goes on it. So you would put in a tomatillo, a jalapeno pepper plant, some kind of an onion. It could be a bulb onion, it could be scallion type onions, whatever onions you choose to use in your salsa verde, and of course some cilantro, because that's an herb that's very often used in Mexican cuisine. And then I think you need, there's probably lime juice, and you're not going to, you could, I do have a lime tree, but it's not something that you're necessarily going to have at hand. But the tomatillo, cousin of the tomato, it's going to need some kind of a support around it. You could use a small tomato cage. It's a big sprawling plant. And just like I recommend with tomatoes, you should prune them to keep them, at least some kind of a compact size, because it'll set more than enough fruit for as much salsa verde as you want to eat. So there's my kind of design number one. Design number two, I call it the Bangkok Banquet. So you could do a Thai vegetable stir fry. So you would have some sugar snap or some snow peas, any kind of Chinese cabbage or Chinese green, a little eggplant. Little fingers is one of those small eggplants, some Thai red chilies, of course, and maybe some lemongrass and some garlic chives. So these could all be put into it would have to be a fairly big container, but you can roll them into one container. And if you're really feeling adventurous, you could even try growing your own ginger root. Sometimes the ginger that you buy from the grocery store will actually have like growing tips on it. And I do have one pot that I'm growing now. I actually allowed it to grow. So I have a plant that's about, it does take a long time though for ginger to actually form new roots. So, it's, again, something you could try to be a little bit different. So here's my Viva Italia planter. So I call it the pizza planter. So a Roma or a plum tomato that, typically are the tomatoes that are used for pizza sauce. So you want to grow some kind of a meatier tomato that doesn't have too much juice in it. A sweet bell pepper if you like to have a little bit of bell pepper on your pizza, or hot peppers if your choice is to hot peppers, some Genovese basil, and Italian parsley. Those all can be put together in one planter. And I said you want to make sure you group plants together that have the same. So these all like a consistent amount of moisture. But in a separate container, you could grow oregano, thyme, and rosemary. Why separate? Because these are plants that are that like heat and they like to dry out. So these are plants that you can actually grow in a container of mixture that has maybe a bit more sand and grit in it, that drains more freely, because those are the kinds of conditions that they would typically grow in the Mediterranean, but would make a great addition to your pizza planter. Last one I called Eat Your Greens. So here's the summer green salad bowl, and what's great about this is, as I've said, because these are cool season, typically the greens are cool season, you can actually put these in partial shade. So this is a container that you could grow where it gets maybe the morning sun, but would be shaded in the afternoon, and they would do just fine. And, you know, and nothing like upcycling an old colander and planting lots of cool different lettuces in it and having them right on your table. I mean, you know, how cool is that? So baby kale, baby spinach, arugula, oak leaf lettuce, which has just the lovely cut edges that look like oak leaves, mesclans, any kind of combination. You could throw any of the Chinese greens in there if you wanted to, and just keep cutting it and making salads. And sometimes these are called cut and come again lettuces, because you'll cut them and they will regrow. So have a lot of fun with that. And that's it. Any more questions?
How would you grow garlic?
How would you grow garlic?
I've heard some people say, no, you need special bulbs. And other people say, oh, you can use the bulbs from the grocery store. And you can plant them in the fall and get them next spring, kind of thing.
So I grow garlic. Do not use the bulbs from the grocery store.
Okay.
The bulbs from the grocery store are grown in China, unless you can find locally grown garlic in your grocery store. So if it's Ontario grown garlic, you could grow it. But if it's not, I wouldn't. I would go, you can go to a farmer's market in, we're almost into garlic season. So if you have a local farmer's market, do you have one in, yeah, you do in Pickering, don't you?
Yeah, there's the online farmers market now too, so you can order directly from a lot of the farmers.
Right. So if you go to a farmer's market and you find somebody who is selling garlic, it's inevitably locally grown garlic. One of the most common varieties is called Music. I do have Music in my garden. Garlic is planted in the fall. So typically around the same time you plant your tulip bulbs, you can plant your garlic bulbs. And when you get your garlic, you know, garlic is in a head, right? And you want to be breaking them apart into individual cloves and preparing. So you have to, this isn't something you can necessarily do in a container. And the reason why I wouldn't grow garlic in well, it's just like trying to grow tulip bulbs in a container. The problem that we have is that the roots are exposed to far more cold temperatures than they would be in the ground, and it'll actually end up rotting the bulb. So you would have to grow them in the ground and literally just, you know, prepare a bed, make sure you add, you know, lots of good compost to it, you know, fork it over, rake it down. And then I literally plant my garlic in rows, individual bulbs about 10 centimeters apart. I poke, you know, I have a dibber, so I poke a hole in the ground, I pop my garlic bulb in, pointy end up, and cover it, you know, with maybe that much soil, and that's it. Garlic is dead simple to grow. And you don't have to do anything. I will sometimes mulch my garlic with straw. Once we've had a good hard ground frost, I will mulch it with straw just to provide it a bit of protection in the winter, in case, because they will often start to show like green shoots above the ground even before we get the frost. So I will just do that to cover them up. I'll take the straw off in the spring and you harvest the garlic in July. So it's simple to grow. There's not a lot of work required. You just need the space for it.
Thank you.
Okay. So if you think of any questions, or if, once you go off on your adventure of growing vegetables in containers and you have some issues or questions, feel free to reach out to us. We are the Durham Master Gardeners. There's our website. We do have someone monitor our email one of our volunteers will actually monitor our email, so you can send us a question via email, or you can contact us on Facebook. And if you are someone who's active on social media like Facebook, feel free to go and like us. And we do respond to questions on our Facebook page, or we now are using Instagram as well, so you can also reach out to us on Instagram. That's it.
Awesome. And I'm going to stop the recording now. So thanks to everyone joining us. If you do have any questions, we can stick around and answer those before you head out. But if you're watching later on, make sure that you definitely check out the social media links that are provided to get in touch with Durham Master Gardeners if you have any questions. So thank you if you're watching this later, and we'll keep hanging out if you're watching it right now live.